solen glimmer i aldrig så dansar dig då i.
We are living way beyond our means.
Welcome to Irish History. The Irish media was divided on opinion about the Vietnam War. The Irish Times, being anti-war and printing articles by Colin Crusoe Breen, also sent Ho Chi Minh a book about the 1916 Rising as a refresher course since he knew of Irish history, and the Irish Times denounced the government's unwillingness to condemn the United States bombing of North Vietnam and support the United Nations in resolving the crisis. The Sunday Independent, on the other hand, was pro-war. They condemned the anti-war protesters in 1969 and argued the war would end sooner if people marched to the US Embassy in Dublin to give their support to the US government's war for freedom of all nations. Irish newspapers didn't send their own correspondents on the ground in Vietnam. RTE, in early 1967, was planning to send a news report team to North Vietnam, but Jack Lynch personally intervened and told Todd Andrews, who was chairman of the RTE Authority at the time and a Fianna Fáil supporter, to not send any reporting team to North Vietnam, and Andrews told Director General Kevin McCourt to drop it. But this was defended in the door by Frank Egan, the Minister of External Affairs, on the grounds there are enough material already about the conflict, and RTE didn't have the available expertise to report on it. This left an impression that the government didn't really want anyone to report, which may cause further controversy about the Vietnam War. And these impressions were supported by the actions of Frank Egan regarding the burial of Irish citizens who joined either the American or Australian armed forces in the conflict. The British newspaper, the Sunday Express, picked up on this story and suggested Egan didn't want any reporters to go because North Vietnam would welcome Irish reporters because of Ireland's neutrality. Even though this whole thing was mishandled by the government, the Sunday Independent chimed in on a piece on the 26th of March, 1967, stating, bound to take Irish taxpayers by surprise. For if there's one thing the screens of Montrose do not lack, it is coverage of the Vietnam War. Now maybe it was saving the pennies and not sending any reporters to Vietnam. But if it was the pressure by the government to avoid any controversy about Vietnam, it also extended to the Nigerian Civil War, which I will do a future two-part series on. In October 1967, RTE decided to show less detail about the conflict, which probably was decided by the board of RTE or maybe by the government. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Now, what about the Irish media from the Catholic press? Well, the Irish Catholic was strongly conservative, pro-Franco, who was dictator of Spain, pro-Salazar, who was a dictator of Portugal. They also supported the Vietnam War. They also were anti-EEC, which would be now the EU, and they were pro-neutrality. But they did allow people to write letters to them who were either pro or anti-Vietnam War. And they did have a Vietnam correspondent, an Irish missionary, Father Pat O'Connor, who was strongly anti-communist. Now, as the United States was winding down the war after 1968, the Irish Catholic lamented the United States lost its stomach for the fight. But when 1970 came round and the invasion of Cambodia happened, the newspaper perked up and argued if the anti-war activists got their way and the United States withdrew, then the ultimate winner would be communism, but more importantly, China, and the peace in our time will vanish. The Catholic Standard, on the other hand, was more liberal, anti-war, and saw the arms race as a financial waste, but became more conservative in 1969 and started to ignore the war and became aligned towards the Catholic hierarchy. Now, Irish groups in 1968 wrote letters, petitions, and passed resolutions expressing their opposition to the bombing of North Vietnam by the United States, and even though Pat O'Donnell and Noel Brown Bio-Laws led the movement, other signatories were Chief Justice Covell O'Donoghue, members of Fine Gael like future Taoiseach Garret FitzGerald, although there was a split in the party about the conflict. Irish Ambassador William Fay to the United States wrote, Irish people had much to say. It was one-sided, rather than hearing the view of both sides, and he also stated, the sponsors mentioned Pope Paul VII in the same breath with Utah. It is important to notice that the Pope, unlike the Secretary General, took care to ask the other belligerent party to give a sign of a serious desire for peace. This corresponds with the Taoiseach Annunciation government policy in Copenhagen and is surely the more reasonable line to take. Back in November 1967, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota announced he will be running for the next presidential election, and Fay mentions a picture of St. Thomas More hung in the senator's office, which Fay saw in McCarthy, a heroic knight who refused to ratify injustice and wrong to please his friend, the king. Now we return to late January 1968, and the Tet Offensive happened. This shattered the illusion of the United States winning the war, but even though it was a defeat for the Viet Cong, but seeing it on the television, it energized McCarthy's campaign. Few weeks after McCarthy ran Johnson close in the New Hampshire presidential primary, which Fay wrote, what McCarthy set out to do was to incarnate in his person an alternative to existing policies and thus canalize the Arctic flood of youthful protest into constitutional channels, showing thereby to the alienated that the American system does, in fact, work. The success of his campaign on this score has been an extraordinary phenomenon. That thousands of scruffy bearded youths and untidy girls should travel to New Hampshire at their own expense, sacrificing weekends and making themselves clean for Jean, is to my mind a moving example of what one man can do by courage, honesty, and integrity to lead a nation. But Fay wasn't happy Robert Kennedy joined in on the race for the Democratic nomination, with Fay viewed Kennedy being optimistic, and this does seem he didn't like Kennedy, but nothing does suggest either of them had any contact from each other. The Sunday Press correspondent spoke to apparently 95% of Irish and Irish immigrants and stated they hated Bobby Kennedy and all that he stood for. To say Irish immigrants and Irish Americans had hostile feelings to Kennedy is an understatement, mostly because of the Irish Immigration Bill, otherwise known as the United States Immigration and Nationality Act 1965. It didn't favor Irish immigrants but focused on family reunification and civil rights, which was viewed as giving black people too much of a say in America. Yeesh. Since the escalation of the war from 1964 onwards, till LBJ announced a limited hold of the bombing of North Vietnam 31st March 1968, and he isn't going to rerun for the election, North Vietnam agreed to negotiations almost immediately, but didn't start until nearly the end of the year in 1968. Spring and summer of 1968 was a traumatic time with the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. Kennedy was on the cusp of gaining the Democratic nomination. They attended both funerals, and the latter, Bobby Kennedy, was attended by the Taoiseach, the only foreign leader to be at it, and had a brief meeting with LBJ, which to Faye it seems like the Taoiseach deliberately avoided the discussion of any issue of political importance either in the international or the national field. But, Faye continues, to add one more link to the chain of friendship which binds our two countries together. Anti-war conferred on the Democratic Convention in August to protest. Also to add, the Vice President Humphrey was a Democrat nominee. Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago saw these anti-war protesters as a revolutionary threat and unleashed the full force of the Chicago police, and it was described as a police riot when they were set upon by the demonstrators. Senator Abraham did call out Richard Daley as a Gestapo for the style of tactics of the Chicago police, but Richard Daley replied to Senator Abraham saying, "You motherfucker Jew bastard, get your ass out of Chicago." It pretty much shocked people. Humphrey was thought he would lose a chance of winning the election mostly because of Chicago. Well, he didn't win the election, but it was a tiny margin in the popular vote to Richard Nixon. Johnson agreed during the last days of the presidential campaign to a complete halt of bombing North Vietnam to return to the negotiations and ease North Vietnam attacks. They summarized this would increase the run-in for Humphrey, but not enough to beat Nixon. That is all for today. Slán.